She never thought silence could be a weapon. But Margaret Ann Hollis learned that the hard way. She learned it in a two-room house at the edge of Clayton County, with $3 left in a coffee tin, a daughter sleeping under a thin wool blanket, and a name on a deed that no longer belonged to her. Her husband was gone. Not dead. Not taken. Gone by choice. And he had taken everything with him. The land, the horse, the savings she had stitched together penny by penny over 7 years of marriage. He had cleaned out the pantry, the lockbox under the floorboards, and left behind nothing but dust on the shelves and a silence so thick she could barely breathe through it. But that was not the worst of it. The worst of it was what he left behind without meaning to. The worst was the secret. The kind of secret that does not stay buried. The kind that breathes under the surface, quiet and patient, until one day it claws its way up through the dirt and stands right in front of you. Margaret did not know about it yet, but she was about to find out. And if you have ever lost everything you trusted to be true, stay with this story, because this one is for you. Before we go any further, if you are new here, please take a moment to subscribe and click that notification bell so you never miss a story. And if this one moves you, leave a comment below. Tell us where you are watching from tonight. It means more than you know. Now back to Margaret. She had married Thomas Hollis at 22 years old in the spring, when the wildflowers were coming up along the creek, and she believed with her whole heart that a good man could make a good life. Thomas was handsome in that quiet, steady way that made women in town think he was dependable. He did not drink much. He did not yell. He came home most nights. But there are men who do not yell and do not drink, and still make the air in the house feel like something you cannot fill your lungs with. Thomas was that kind of man. Still, watchful, and with eyes that never quite let you in. Margaret had told herself for years that she was imagining it, that she was being ungrateful. She had a roof. She had her daughter Lily, who was 6 years old and had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She had a garden that bloomed in the summer and a life that, from the outside, looked exactly like what a woman was supposed to want. Then one morning in October she woke up and Thomas was gone. She found the note on the kitchen table, folded once. It said only, "I cannot stay. Do not look for me. The property has been settled." She did not understand what settled meant until she walked to town that afternoon and spoke to old Mr. Haynes at the land office. He looked at her over his spectacles with something between pity and discomfort and told her that Thomas had transferred the deed on the property 3 weeks prior. He had sold it to a man named Cowboy, a cattle rancher from up near the Sawgrass Valley. She was not on the deed. She had never been on the deed. She had 1 week to leave the property. Margaret walked home in a daze, holding Lily's hand, and she sat on the porch steps until the sun went down. Lily leaned against her and did not ask questions, because even at 6 years old, she understood that her mother needed silence more than answers. That night, Margaret allowed herself 1 hour to cry. Then she dried her face, put water on to boil, and started thinking. She had a cousin 2 counties over, a woman named Ruth, who had written once and said she had a spare room. Margaret wrote to her that night, and while she waited for an answer, she took in mending work from the women in town. She sold her good dress. She sold the curtains her mother had sewn for her as a wedding gift. Ruth's letter came back 4 days later. The spare room was no longer available. Ruth had her husband's family staying. She was sorry. She truly was. Margaret sat at the table for a long time after reading that letter. Then she looked at the address at the top of the letter that Mr. Haynes had given her. The name of the man who had purchased her land. Calloway. James Calloway, Sawgrass Valley Ranch. She did not know what she intended to do when she wrote out there. She only knew that she had nowhere else to go, and that she could not sit still and wait for the week to end. She borrowed a neighbor's horse and left Lily with the woman next door and rode 2 hours north to Sawgrass Valley. The ranch was larger than she had expected. The kind of property that announced itself before you could see the house, with the fences stretching out along the road and cattle dotting the hillside, and a red barn sitting solid and serious at the top of the rise. The main house was plain but well kept. A man was working near the gate when she arrived, repairing a section of fence with the kind of quiet focus that meant he had done it 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. He straightened when he heard the horse. He was tall, wide through the shoulders. He had a face that had seen weather and work and something else that she could not name right away, something like grief worn down until it was just a permanent expression. He looked at her without speaking, and his eyes were the pale gray of a winter sky. She had rehearsed what she was going to say on the ride over. She had planned to be reasonable, polite. She had planned to ask if there was any mistake, or if there was any arrangement possible, or if perhaps he might be willing to discuss terms. What she actually said was, "You bought my land without my knowledge, and I have a 6-year-old child and nowhere to go, and I want you to know that I do not think what you did was right." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Come inside." His name was James Calloway, which she already knew. He sat across from her at a table that was clean but otherwise bare, with the spare quality of a house where someone lives alone and has stopped trying to make it look like anything else. He poured 2 cups of coffee and he listened while she spoke. He did not interrupt. He did not look impatient. He looked, if she were being honest, like a man who was genuinely uncomfortable with what he was hearing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I did not know you existed." She said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Thomas Hollis told me he was an unmarried man, told me he had no family. I would not have moved forward with the purchase otherwise." The words landed somewhere in the middle of her chest and sat there like a stone. Thomas had told him he was unmarried, which meant that Thomas had not simply abandoned her. He had erased her. He had looked this man in the eye and told him there was no wife, no daughter, no life built inside those walls. He had made her disappear on paper long before he ever left. She felt the room tilt slightly. She set her coffee cup down very carefully. James Calloway was watching her. He said, "I have a proposal, if you are willing to hear it." She said nothing, which he took as permission. He told her that the ranch had belonged to him and his late wife Eleanor for 11 years. Eleanor had passed 2 winters ago. He had a son, 8 years old, named Samuel, who was currently staying with a schoolteacher in town because James had not yet found a permanent arrangement. He said he needed a housekeeper and a cook and someone to look after Samuel while he worked. He said he had 4 rooms in the house, and she and her daughter could occupy 2 of them. He said he would pay her a small wage in addition to room and board, and that she could stay as long as the arrangement suited them both. He said it all in the same measured tone a man uses when he is reading from a list. She studied him for a long moment. She said, "Why would you do that?" He picked up his coffee and looked out the window and said, "Because Hollis lied to me too. And I believe a person ought to correct a wrong when they find themselves in a position to do it." It was not a warm answer. It was not a romantic answer. It was exactly the kind of answer that made her trust it. She moved in the following morning. The first weeks were careful and quiet. Margaret learned the house the way you learn a borrowed thing, touching everything gently, figuring out what was delicate and what was solid. She cooked and mended and scrubbed and organized, and the house responded slowly, the way houses do when someone starts caring for them again. Samuel came home from town within the week, a serious boy with his father's pale eyes and a way of watching things very closely before he decided what he thought of them. Lily and Samuel did not immediately become friends. They circled each other for several days, polite and wary, the way children are when they understand that the adults around them are navigating something complicated. Then one afternoon, Margaret heard laughter coming from the yard, and she looked out the window to see them both crouched over something in the dirt, heads together, apparently in deep discussion about whatever creature they had found. After that, they were inseparable. James Calloway was not easy to know. He rose before the sun and worked until it went down, and spoke in short sentences, and had the habit of looking at a person for just a beat too long before he answered, as if he was weighing each word separately. But he was also never unkind. He asked Samuel about his lessons every evening at supper. He noticed when Margaret was tired and shortened the list of things that needed doing without saying anything about it. He carved a small horse out of scraps of wood one evening and left it on the kitchen table without explanation, and when Lily found it the next morning and asked where it came from, he said he had extra wood. Margaret watched him with that carved horse in her hand and felt something she did not know what to do with yet. 2 months passed, then 3. The secret arrived on a cold Tuesday in December. A man came to the gate on horseback. Margaret saw him from the kitchen window and went still. She did not recognize him, but something about the way he sat his horse, unhurried and sure of himself, made the back of her neck go cold. James was in the barn. She watched the man ride to the barn, and she watched James come out, and she watched the way James went very still when he saw who it was. She could not hear what was said, but she watched the conversation for nearly 10 minutes, and when the man rode away, James stood in the yard for a long time before he came inside. He did not tell her what it was about. He went quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. This was a closed quiet, a guarded one. She did not ask. She waited. 3 days later, she found a letter on the floor near the door, as if it had been slid under. It was not addressed to James. It was addressed to her. The handwriting she recognized. Thomas. She sat at the table and opened it. It was not long. It said only this: Margaret, you need to leave that ranch. Calloway is not who you think. He knows what I did and he is part of it. I have been watching. Get out before the spring. I mean this for the children. Her hands were shaking slightly when she set the letter down. She sat with it for a very long time. She thought about what Thomas had said. She thought about the conversation in the yard. She thought about the way James had gone quiet. And then she thought about every small thing James Calloway had done since the day she arrived. The quiet corrections. The respect. The carved horse. The way he looked at Samuel every evening at supper, as if reassuring himself that the boy was still there and still whole. She made her choice. She found James in the barn that evening, working alone by lantern light. She said, I received a letter from Thomas today. He turned and looked at her. She said, he told me to leave, that you are involved in something, that I should get out before spring. James set down the tool in his hand. He looked at the lantern for a long moment and then looked at her. He said, sit down, Margaret. And she did. He told her everything. He told her that Thomas Hollis had come to him 3 years ago, before the sale, and had tried to involve him in a fraudulent land scheme involving forged deeds across 4 counties. He told her that he had refused, and that Thomas had threatened him and then disappeared. He told her that the man who had come to the gate was a man Thomas owed money to, a man who had been told by Thomas that James was the one holding certain documents. He told her that he had already sent word to the county marshal, that it was nearly resolved. He said, your husband did not just steal from you when he left. He had been stealing from others for years. The man you were married to was hiding a great deal. I am sorry that you are the one who has to hear it now. There was something about hearing it said plainly, without softness and without harshness, that made it easier. She sat with the information and let it settle, and then she looked at this man sitting across from her in the lantern light and said, why did you not tell me sooner? He said, because I wanted to be certain before I took apart something you might still have needed to believe. She looked at him for a long time. She said quietly, I stopped needing to believe in Thomas the night he left. The marshal came out the following week. Thomas was located in a town 2 days east and taken into custody shortly after. The fraudulent scheme was unraveled over the following months, and Margaret was named in the proceedings not as a suspect, but as a victim, which meant there were certain protections that came along with her testimony, including a small portion of recovered funds. It was not much, but it was hers. Winter came down hard on Sawgrass Valley that year. There was a week of ice storms that kept everyone close to the house, and during that week something shifted in the way the 4 of them moved around each other. They cooked together and read aloud in the evenings, and Samuel fell asleep on the rug near the fire one night, with Lily curled beside him like 2 cats finding warmth, and Margaret looked up from her mending and found James watching her from across the room with an expression that he did not hide quickly enough. She held his gaze for just a moment. He looked back at the fire. Neither of them said anything, but something had been said. Spring came slow and soft, the way it does after a hard winter, as if the land had earned it. One evening in April, James found her in the garden, planting the first seeds of the year. He stood at the edge of the garden for a moment, and then he came and crouched beside her and helped her press the seeds into the earth, and they worked together in silence for a while, and the silence was the good kind this time. He said, I would like you to stay. Not as my housekeeper. She pressed her hands into the dirt and felt the cold of it and the realness of it, and she did not answer right away. He said, I know you have had poor reason to trust what a man tells you. She said, I have. He said, I am not asking you to trust me all at once. I am only asking you to consider staying. She looked up at him, and the late light was in his gray eyes, and she thought about everything she had lost and everything she had carried, And every morning she had gotten up and made another choice to keep going. And she thought about Lily and Samuel laughing in the yard. And she thought about how the house had stopped feeling borrowed. She said, "I will consider it." He nodded once and went back to pressing seeds into the earth. She smiled down at the dirt. She stayed. Not right away, and not easily, and not without long conversations and careful steps. But she stayed. And the day that felt most like a beginning to her was not the day James took her hand and asked her properly, though that day was quiet and lovely in its own way. It was the morning 3 months later when she was standing at the kitchen window, and Lily came inside from the yard and called out from the hallway, without thinking, without trying, in the simple way children speak when they feel safe. "Mama, Samuel says, can we go down to the creek?" And Margaret said yes. And from the doorway behind her, James said, "I will take you both." And Lily grabbed Samuel's hand and they ran out into the yard together, already arguing happily about who would find the better stones. And Margaret stood at the window, and the valley stretched out green and warm under the April sky, and the land felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like something that belonged to her. Not because she owned it, because she had been chosen by the people in it. And that, she had learned, was the only kind of belonging that had ever been worth anything at all. If this story reached you tonight, if it stirred something in you, we would love to hear about it. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what part moved you. And if you know someone who might need a story like this one, please share it with them. Stories like this are meant to be passed on. Subscribe if you have not yet. There are many more stories waiting, and every single one of them ends with someone finally finding their way home.